We think that the first vocabulary is more or less correct, that it is good and useful to look at Confucianism as a philosophy and religion of sincerity. But we, and again I refer to, when I say we, to Paul and myself, not to me in the plural, that we think that the application of this authenticity vocabulary to Taoist philosophy and Taoist religion is problematic. And what we're doing in the book is two things. Number one, we show that and why this application of an authenticity vocabulary to Taoism is problematic, and then secondly we suggest a different vocabulary to understand Taoist philosophy, and this different vocabulary is a vocabulary around the notion that we coined, namely genuine pretending, and I'm going to explain that during the talk. And a third point, which I'm not going to talk much about because I don't have time, is to point out that humor is an important philosophical method, an important philosophical style that is developed in the book of Zhuangzi, and that it is very important in order to understand the notion of genuine pretending, to understand the function of humor in the text. So we argue that it is a thoroughly humorous text and quite unique perhaps in using humor as a philosophical method. All right, now about this vocabulary of sincerity and authenticity. This is not our vocabulary. We took it from a book by Lionel Trilling, which was published in the 1970s. Lionel Trilling published this book, Sincerity and Authenticity, and he was a scholar of literature, and he applied it to reading the development of modern literature and modern thought in Europe. These two notions, sincerity and authenticity, were taken up by Charles Taylor, one of the most famous living philosophers, who created the notion of the age of authenticity. So according to Charles Taylor, we can say that modernity, particularly Western modernity, is characterized as an age of authenticity, and that it very much consists in a transition of seeing ourselves, seeing our identity, seeing human identity, no longer in terms of sincerity, but in terms of an authenticity ideal. In order to truly become ourselves, we must truly become authentic, and this is for him the core idea of modernity. Okay, we go to the next one. So what do these two terms mean? What does sincerity mean? What does authenticity mean? Well, sincerity simply means being true to one's social role. So by social role, what is meant by this are particularly roles in the family, the role as a mother, the role as a daughter, the role as a father, or other roles within the society. You can also think about, if you want to conceive of it in contemporary context, of whatever, a role in a sports team. You're the coach, or whatever, you're in football. I guess some of you will know a little bit about football. You know, whatever, you're the goalkeeper or you're the defender, and then you have to stick to your role, and your whole identity is being built up by role commitment. You can also think about roles in the military, right? We have other kind of social conflicts, somewhat similar to sports, where you have to fulfill a certain role and you build up your identity by a commitment, internal commitment to this role. So on the one hand, this leads to identity building, and secondly, it also, of course, leads to a certain ethics. You're a good person if you fulfill your role sincerely, and you're a bad person if you don't. And this, of course, then also goes along with a certain form of education. Education is geared towards training people to commit and fulfill their roles sincerely. So the whole education framework is also geared towards becoming sincere. And sincere means two things, that Your actions, of course, are fully in line with your role, but sometimes even more importantly, that you're also emotionally committed to your role. So your feelings have to be in it because your actions are supposed to be grounded in your feelings. So in this sense, we can say that the vector of sincerity, if we want to use this metaphor, points from the inside to the outside. Your inner feelings are supposed to be backing up your external actions, which happen in the public sphere. So you orient yourself with your feelings and emotions towards your outside social persona. And if this orientation works, then you are a sincere person, and then you build up a sincere identity and become who you are. Now, in modernity, according to Trilling, thank you, this changed. And what happens in modernity is that a new idea comes to the fore. And this idea is the following idea, the idea that somewhere under all these roles there is me, that poor old ultimate actuality who, when all the roles have been played, would like to murmur of opulendings and settle down with his own actual or original actual self. So this is the idea that these roles are only certain facades, that they're an outside performance, and that they're not a true representation of what we really are. So a new form of identity arises, an identity that has to be discovered or created that is not in line with the socially prescribed roles. And maybe the most important image or metaphor that is used in accordance with this authenticity ideal is the metaphor of the mask. And you see this on the picture here, right? The external roles just seem to be now some kind of masks. And the idea is that you need to uncover, find out what is behind this mask. And then you find your authentic self. So in philosophy, again, Charles Taylor gave some definitions of authenticity. What's important with it is now that this old idea of role fulfillment looks no longer ethically ideal. Just to be a sincere person, just to be committed to your roles, now looks like just being, following conformity, and conformity is now seen as something inauthentic. It's something that is no longer good, right? So you have to rebel against conformity. So that's also an important ethical change that then happens. You need to be original, unique. You need to go against the conventions. Right? That's now a new ethical expectation. So we see this here as well. We have an understanding of life. Authenticity is an understanding of life that each of us has his or her own way of realizing humanity, and that it is important to find and live out one's own as against surrendering to conformity, right? No, don't surrender to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside by society or the previous generation or religious or political authority, right? This is kind of an ethical command of the Western Enlightenment, and this is what makes us a modern person and makes us an authentic being, that we don't surrender to conformity. We go to the next one. I want to point out some, Paul and I, think that authenticity is quite paradoxical, and we'll point out several of the paradoxes. One is actually found in this definition of what authenticity is by Charles Taylor, namely that authenticity involves creation and construction as well as discovery. So we basically have these two quite contradictory definitions of authenticity, which Taylor here combines into one, namely that you're supposed to, on the one hand, create and construct yourself, But at the same time, you're also supposed to discover yourself, right? That's contradictory. If you discover yourself, then you're born with your true self, and you just have to discover it, or you have to construct and to create it. But that's very different from discovery. Anyways, typically the semantics, the language, the morality of authenticity, typically and paradoxically combines these two notions. A further paradox of authenticity we can see in the following. So now, of course, your social appearance, your outside, is not supposed to express role, but is supposed to reflect your unique and inner self. So you create your social persona according to your true self. That is the idea. So you have to find and express the true self, and then judge all relationships in terms of it. And but then this brings to the fore, this ideal brings to the fore another paradox of authenticity, another paradoxical aspect of it, namely that authenticity is typically copied, right? And we see this in the advertisements here. Advertising commercials very much sell authenticity and sell the authentic identity to you by buying a certain brand of clothes or something like this, or by listening to a certain kind of music, you express your authenticity. But of course that's paradoxical, because you become authentic by copying the authenticity of someone else. And basically it's impossible to not do this, because whenever someone tells you to be authentic, then you're learning to be authentic from someone else, right? You learn the social idea of authenticity, so authenticity is inherently paradoxical. Nevertheless, and now we go to Taoist and Chinese philosophy, what we see what we saw in the West, again, we believe that Trilling was right, was this transition from sincerity to authenticity that happened in modernity. And authenticity was a rebellion against sincerity, right? So authenticity was seen as that what happens when sincerity is critiqued and overcome. So the kind of model in the West was that if you're not sincere, and if you're no longer sincere, and if you critique sincerity, then you must be authentic, right? Authenticity was the one and only alternative towards sincerity. And interestingly enough, if you look at the Western literature or at the modern literature about Taoism, then it very much follows the mold that Trilling was describing for modern European literature. So basically the reasoning, which is either explicit or implicit, is that, well, Taoism critiques Confucianism. Confucianism is an ethics of sincerity, and therefore Taoism must be an ethics of authenticity, and must also conceive of identity and of human nature as being authentic. So in this sense, the overwhelming reading of Taoist philosophy was Taoism as the pursuit of authenticity. And this was then also reintroduced into Chinese readings of Taoism, that also contemporary Chinese authors overwhelmingly read Taoism as a philosophy of authenticity. We just have a few quotes here. Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi maintains that authenticity necessitates attunement to the Tao, just as Heidegger insists that authenticity be grounded in being. So Heidegger becomes one of the really poster boys for authenticity. And then, so we have all these readings of Heidegger and Asian thought that kind of, the authentic Heidegger, the defender of authenticity in the West, is kind of the best link between modern Western philosophy and Taoist philosophy. We'll go to the next slide. We have the same thing here. Another author, Guoling Shang, imports a notion of self-overcoming and self-creation to explain the genuine person in Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is all about to be yourself and a creator of yourself. And then we find often also references to Nietzsche in this regard. Okay, now we go to the next one. Now, back to Confucianism. Confucianism, we think, is, as I said earlier, actually quite correctly described and understood of in terms of an ethics of sincerity. The Confucian ethical vision can be understood as very much a relational ethics, an ethics that is concerned with how we relate to others within a group, within a community. And so what it is very much about, and here we agree with two of the main contemporary interpreters of Confucianism, is that one ought to live, not play their roles. This is a quote from Ames and Rosemond. They are two leading interpreters of Confucianism, and this is a phrase that they constantly use to understand what Confucianism, to describe how their understanding of what Confucianism is all about. That's really the most important thing about Confucianism, that you develop your identity, you cultivate yourself by living and not merely playing your roles, right? And that's sincerity. People construct their identity by existentially committing themselves to their social roles. And in the terminology of the actual early Chinese texts, one way of expressing sincerity is through this philosophy of Zheng-Ming. Ming is usually translated with name, but it means the assignment of your role, right? So father is a name that you have to live up to, and then you have to correct yourself so that your personality, your identity corresponds correctly to the name that indicates your role. So by truly becoming a father, truly becoming a mother, truly becoming a daughter, truly becoming a son, and so forth, you make the names correct. So it's about the correspondence of names and actuality. Names indicating roles, actualities indicating your personal performance and experience of the role. So what Confucianism in this sense is about a dual correspondence. As I said earlier, on the behavioral level, the performance has to match the role, and on the level of emotionality or personal experience, a person's feeling must sincerely correspond to the role performance. And in this way, you develop identity. And again, to connect this with the topic of the conference, the Confucians make the claim that this is human nature, right? These roles are not just social conventions. Motherhood and being a daughter, that is the Confucian claim, is not something that is somehow invented or constructed. This is what human nature is. So you can only develop human nature, become a truly human being through this dual correspondence with the names, with the roles that are supposed to be the indicators of what correct human being is about. This results, as Paul and I call it, in a regime of sincerity, right? As I said earlier, Confucianism is very much an education program. It's a domestication program, and it trains people to achieve sincerity. This may sound nice, but in fact, we think the regime of sincerity can easily lead to over-identification with one's social roles and all kinds of pathologies. So again, this is important. We think that Taoism is very much about indicating the pathologies that develop under a regime of sincerity. It points out the craziness and the suffering that results from humans or society imposing such a regime of sincerity onto itself. That is for us the core of at least the Taoist text Zhuangzi. So what are these problems that are produced by a regime of sincerity? Well, simply put, three problems. Number one, stress. You always have to check yourself, and again, like if you read the Confucian text, that's what they are very often about. You have to check your social appearance and status. You have to constantly check if you're a good mother, if you're a good daughter, if you're a good father, if you're a good ruler, and you have to constantly check yourself and make sure and impose yourself this constant checking. This doesn't only have to do, with generally how your appearance, but it goes into every detail of what you're doing, how you sit, how you talk, even how you sleep. In the Confucian Analects, there are even advice of what posture you have to assume when you're asleep in order to really correspond to your role correctly. So there's a constant stress involved in this, and you can still see that in many Asian societies. Then, of course, what also comes along with this very easily are feelings of worthlessness, because the roles are typically hierarchical, right? There's a hierarchy not only between men and women, and between husband and wife, but also the hierarchy, for instance, between the older and the younger brother. Or so the roles are not just simply assignment of neutral relationships, but this network of relationships is highly hierarchical. So you're always either in a lower or in an upper position. And of course, this can easily produce feelings of worthlessness, because after all, you're supposed to identify through this. If you're not really internalized the idea, for instance, as a daughter or as a woman, that you're inferior to your husband, then you do not live up, you do not achieve identity. It becomes part of the educational program. Basically, it's an institutionalized and internalized inferiority complex in the case you're born into a lower role. And of course, the same happens the other way around if you're in a higher role, right? Whatever, if you're a professor, you're supposed to internalize that you're a very, respectful person, and that you're like intellectually superior to those around you, and that you can teach them. And at the same time, you're supposed to identify yourself with this, and therefore, just as it produces worthlessness, it also basically systematically institutionalizes conceit as a form of building up personal identity. So the whole Confucian system of ethics then corresponds to this regime of sincerity. And we think that this is again what at least the text Zhuangzi's and also the Tao Jing to a large extent is about. It is a critique, it is a subversion of the Confucian ethics, of the Confucian virtues, as basically being psychopathic and sociopathic norms that lead to a psychopathic and sociopathic social structure. So it looks typically, the Taoist texts typically look at the Confucian texts as establishing a system of virtues that are in fact not virtues, but that are pathological aspects of being human. This is a picture of a Chinese family taken about 120 years ago, and there you can very much see how this Confucian regime of sincerity, along with its ethics, results in social classifications and role assignments. And so the men are on the left, the women are on the right. What they wear corresponds with their position within the family. So everything indicates their role, the position in the photo, what they wear, their compartment, how they behave, and even, of course, the length of the hair, or in the case of the woman, even the length of their feet, because the woman has bound feet. And of course, for a woman in this society, this would be internalized, and she wouldn't regard her bound feet as something that is pathological. If she identifies correctly with her role, she will regard this binding of her feet as something that is, her identity, and that makes her a very good and correct person. It is that what it is. It basically follows the doctrine of Zhengming. So through being trained in this regime, you can assume positions like this, and you can impose a bodily regime like this, because you're dually committed to it. You're double committed to it. You have your emotions fully in it. And again, Taoism is supposed, we think, or Taoism has, at least parts of Taoist philosophy try to question this and actually show that this is not human nature, that this is not an expression of what human nature is, but that it is a brutal and ridiculous regime. So we find these critiques already in the Tao Te Ching. This is a Tao Te Ching chapter 18, which says basically that these human virtues are not virtues, but that they are an expression of decay, of pathology. When the great way is dispensed with, then there is humanity and righteousness. And when knowledge and smartness come out, then there is great hypocrisy, knowledge and smartness about what is right in society. When the 6 family relationships are not harmonious, then there is filial piety and compassion. When states and families are in disorder, then there are committed ministers. So it basically shows, it basically says the opposite of what the Confucians say, namely that the Confucian virtues are not indicators of a society that is correct and healthy and in accordance with nature, but very much to the contrary, that the commitment to these values, such as humanity and righteousness, filial piety and compassion, signal and are symbols of a highly pathological state. We go to the next one. So, from a Taoist perspective, this regime of sincerity is a problem and not a solution. From a Taoist perspective, Confucian social role-related values are not natural, right? They are not expressing human nature, but they are externally imposed norms and constraints. And according from a Taoist perspective, the insistence on Confucian morality brings about falsity, hypocrisy, and selfishness. Right? And so, in this sense, Confucian morality is seen as a part of the problem that it claims to resolve. It tries to bring about social order and personal flourishing, but in effect, it does exactly the opposite. I want to just quote this passage here from the Zhuangzi because I think it relates more to the topic of the conference than other quotes from this text. This is not a very well-known passage, but I think it is quite relevant. It's taken from chapter 29, where we have a very notorious figure of the time, the robber Zhe, who was like some form of a leader of a criminal gang, a gangster at the time, who is discussing with Confucius, and who is, of course, representing the social order. So we have this form of chapo, as you would say in Spanish. I don't know what the Portuguese word for this is, right? This leader of a criminal gang discussing with a representative of the government and the social order. And this is taken from his speech to Confucius. And what he does here in this speech, what the robber does is he basically reverses the Confucian narrative of what civilization is and what Confucian cultivation does to humanity. The typical Confucian narrative is, well, when people lived in a state of nature, this was a state of total disorder and chaos. And then the Confucian sages came and they introduced, in accordance with human nature, a certain social order, particularly family order, right? The institution of the family, the founding of the institution of the family was the root of all social order. So the typical Confucian narrative is that all social and political power structures are the embellishment of human nature, which was which was like promoted by the early Confucian sages, which thereby helped to move society from a primitive, uncivilized stage into a developed civilizational stage. So this is the typical human narrative, Confucian narrative, and therefore we need Confucianism. Confucianism is that which brings us into civilization and which prevents us from falling back into this primitive state of disorder and being uncultivated. And here in this encounter, in this dialogue between the robber Zhe and Confucius, robber Zhe reverses this narrative. And this is like a shocking move We think it is very much a satirical, a parodic, a humoristic, like almost like a comedy that shows the ridiculousness of the Confucian claim. So what the rubber here says to Confucius is reversing this cultivation history, this civilization history. He says, in the age of Shen Nung, so this is like in the early stage of civilization, the people lay down in simple innocence and rose up in quiet security. They lived basically like animals, and importantly, they knew their mothers but did not know their fathers, right? So there was free sex. So people would just have children, but there was no institution of the family, so people would not know their fathers. And this is, of course, the most shocking thing you can say to a Confucian, right? That there's kind of total anarchy. They dwelt along with elks and deer. There was no distinction between human and non-human. They plowed and ate, they wove and made clothes, they lived a very simple life, but they had no idea of injuring one another. There was no conflict, right? They lived in this perfect peace. This was a grand time of perfect virtue. Perfect virtue is now here again an ironic use of a core Confucian term, right? The time of perfect virtue, according to the robber, was not something that came with the sages, but it was precisely something that came before the sages and that the sages then destroyed. Huang Di now, the yellow emperor, a paragon of Confucian virtue, according to the robber, was not able to perpetuate this virtue state. He fought with Jiyo in the wild of Zhou. So the Jiyo is like a native tribe leader, is the name of the native tribe. So eliminated, he basically committed genocide, and the blood flowed over 100 li. And when these other emperors arose, Yao and Shun, they instituted their crowd of ministers, a totally corrupt government of people who are just trying to exploit for their own gain the resources. Maybe something you're slightly familiar with. And Tang banished his lord, King Wu killed Zhou. So they were not only exploiting the resources, they were also constantly even fighting oneself and killing oneself and everything other than being peaceful. Now, importantly, traditionally, this passage, if it's ever read, it's, as I said earlier, it's not something that is often read. It is said, oh, the Taoists are all about defending a primitivist state of society. They want us to go back to this ideal state of nature before civilization. And we think that's not true. We think that this depiction of the state of nature is not meant as a straightforward description. And in fact, actually, it's not true, right? I mean, I don't know about any indigenous society that live in perfect peace and that have no social order, that have no family structures whatsoever, right? The story isn't meant. This is how it's been read from a modernist perspective, right? After this idea that came up in modernity of the noble savage, right? Of this kind of ideal projection of an ideal indigenous society that preceded civilization. That's a typical modernist reading of the story. If you read the story in context, again, I think it's pretty clear that it is meant as a parody, kind of stand-up comedian performance by Robert Zhe, which is just merely supposed to show the ridiculousness of the Confucian claim that their society is a correct cultivation of human nature, right? That is the point of the story. It's not about advocating a primitivist way to go back to a pre-technological life, particularly because this was written like 2,000 years ago, where there was no technological society, there was no environmental damage. This was all not there. It wasn't written in today's society. Really, the point is, because this is in a dialogue with Confucius, to point out the hypocrisy of the claim that the Confucian regime of morals, of sincerity, is rooted in any kind of state of nature. That is what this passage is supposed to point out. And then, of course, secondly, it's supposed to point out that this Confucian regime of sincerity is a brutal regime that brings out violence and all kinds of other not so nice things. Okay, next slide. So, the critique of the Confucian ethics by the Taoists is then the following, that what the Confucians try to do is to kind of sell their ethics as natural and as coming from nature, whereas in fact it's a socially imposed external system. And this then the Confucians ask, that's what they ask the people to do, is to internalize this, and then after the fact treat it as if it was natural, right? You have to submit to your role, whatever, as mother or as daughter, as if this was the human nature. Whereas in fact, again, as the previous passage shows, it's by no means the case that these social roles and this social system stems from human nature. So this internalization program, this is really the core paradox of Confucianism, that through your own cultivation efforts, through your own internalizations, you naturalize what is not natural, right? You internalize certain roles as natural, even though they're clearly socially enforced. And this is what is at the heart of the pathology. So you commit to roles, let's say, of daughter or mother, and you internalize by acting as if this was natural, and as if you would not correspond to the role of daughter and mother, then you would be unnatural, right? So this is really how the power of this regime of sincerity, that you are supposed to naturalize that which is not natural, right? And that's really, I think, what also the previous passage is to point out, through humorous and parodic means, really to bring about this shock experience, that this whole education that you're exposed to asks you to naturalize that which is not natural and which cannot be naturalized because it isn't natural. And this program, this Confucian program can be one programmatic expression of this Confucian program is in a core Confucian text, the Doctrine of the Mean, where it says, sincerity is the Tao, or the way of nature and heaven, and making it sincere is the Tao, or the way of humankind, right? There is this natural order, and you have to submit to it, just as the stars submit to, and the moon and stars, whatever they go, their natural course. And so you have to commit yourself to following the supposedly natural social roles, and this is what makes you truly human, right? So this is again the idea that the Confucians always say, our system of social relationships is just as natural as the relationships between the stars and the moon on heaven, and they follow their course naturally, and you have to do it in the same way, right? You have to be as much at ease with your bound feet, so to speak, and commit to it just as the stars on the heaven just also follow their way. And if you don't do it, then you're not human. We find, again, I think, a parodic inversion of this in the Taoist text, where the Zhuangzi says that at least the Taoist people do not, with their personality, enter into what is from heaven. They do not internalize these roles. So we think that there's a counter-ideal, not a counter-ideal, there's a subversion of this ideal of role commitment is found in the Taoist text, and we have an almost ironic counter persona to the Confucian sage, which is this Taoist Genren, or the genuine person, who is just capable of not internalizing the roles. That is what makes the Taoist Genren a Genren. Ironically, paradoxically, that is someone who does not follow the social conscriptions. It doesn't internalize the roles that they find themselves in by natural or social coincidence. Instead, they enact their roles playfully and skillfully, but they do not live them as their identity. They do not identify with their social phase. But again, importantly, they're also not trying to be authentic, right? They are not committing to sincerity. They are subverting sincerity, but they're not pursuing like an alternative regime of authenticity. They're not trying to find and identify or create or discover their true self. Instead, the idea is that genuine pretending, what that means is that you understand that any role that you have is played, and that you cannot but play roles. There is no correspondence between social roles and any kind of natural essence. So we cannot but assume certain roles, but you do not go the second step and then say this role is an actual expression of my true identity. And from a Taoist perspective, this is like a general condition of being human, right? We all have to live in one kind of society or another, and we all have to play one role or another. But we have the option to understand that whatever roles we play, and we must play roles, they are being played. So instead of pretending that roles can ever genuinely express selfhood, we understand, on the other hand, that whatever we do in society is adopting certain roles. And we do not try to build up the pretense of genuineness, but on the other hand, we do the opposite, and we enact the roles by knowing that they are just temporary, coincidental roles that we find ourselves in. And then we develop the skill to move from one role to another while not being attached, not being attached to it and not internalizing, so that we can also shift roles constantly, right? And that we don't take those roles too seriously. And this is basically what this notion of the genuine refers to in the words of chapter 41 of the Tao Te Ching, that this gen resembles variation. So it's the opposite of authenticity. It's not the attempt to find true authenticity, but the capacity to shift your roles along with social changes and different social circumstances. So, in this sense, a definition of this genren that we find in the Zhuangzi is that genren is someone who managed to assume any appearance on the way. Yes, sorry, I missed that. These are the phrases in Chinese. So, gen resembles variation, and gen consists in managing to assume any appearance on the way. There is no falseness or hypocrisy involved in this. There is no contradiction between an authentic self and an inauthentic role player. Playing roles is seen as a general existential condition of social life, and this is realized by a genuine pretender. I think I'm at the end of my time, right? And then I'll just skip this, and we'll leave it here. Maybe we can just go to the picture. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Müller, for your insightful paper, bringing us a kind of mapping of Confucianism, in some sense as an ethic of sincerity, and Taoism as an ethics of authenticity. Então a gente vai abrir para perguntas, tá? A gente ainda tem uns 10 minutos, correto? A gente começou com 15 minutos de atraso, então vamos até 10:15, né?
Thank you. Quite simple question. Could you please show me the Chinese letter for the idea of authenticity?
The Chinese?
Chinese letter.
You mean Chinese character?
Chinese character.
For what?
For authenticity.
Well, there is no, it's, as I said, it's like a term that is imposed by the modern Western discourse on the traditional Chinese philosophical, on traditional Chinese philosophy. We don't think that there is a term in traditional Chinese philosophy, but what the Chinese authors use are usually terms that are used in the Chinese translations of texts by Heidegger and others. So they use something like Ben Run or other texts like this. Well, Gen is, but we don't think that Gen is authenticity. That's the whole point of the paper. Yeah, yeah.
And Heidegger was for authenticity.
Well, Eigentlichkeit, right? This is what they usually get.
Yeah. Eigentlichkeit.
Yeah. That's what the you know, Eigentlichkeit in English becomes authenticity, and then in Chinese they translate authenticity into Chinese terms. Oh, thank you very much.
Alô? Dilip, eu queria fazer uma pergunta, ou eu faço em alemão e traduzo, ou eu faço em português e você traduz para ele, porque o inglês é um pouco macarrônico. O que eu faço? Em alemão? Darf ich auf Deutsch die Frage stellen,
ja,
du antwortet auf Englisch?
Genau,
Das ist okay,
genau.
Dann ich übersetze dann meine Frage, weil mein Englisch ist ein bisschen peinlich, okay? Georg, ja, ich danke dir sehr für deinen Vortrag. Das ist ganz gut und ganz okay. Aber ich habe ein paar Fragen. Und meine Fragen sind eigentlich über die Trennung, dass du machst zwischen konfuzianischer Perspektive und taoistischer Perspektive. Und das ist eine sehr traditionelle westliche Interpretation. Und meine Frage ist, warst du nicht zu hart mit dem Konfuzianismus und zu leicht mit dem Taoismus? Und hast du nicht viele von dem Konfuzianismus, was wir nach Konfuzius entwickelt hat, und kommst du zurück immer zu taoistischen Texten? Und das bedeutet, die Sozialentwicklung von Konfuzianismus ist nicht so genau, wie Konfuzius geplant hat. Und das ist erst eine Frage. Aber warum? Ich denke, es gibt viele Ähnlichkeiten zwischen Konfuzius und Taoismus, vor allem Konfuzius und Zhuangzi und Laozi. Die kommen zurück zu bestimmten Sachen, die zur Geschichte der chinesischen Philosophie gehören. Dann die Idee von Bewegung ist immer da. Und das bedeutet, wenn man Konfuzius betrachtet, nach der Perspektive von dem I Ching, das ist ein sehr wichtiges Buch für Konfuzius, dann können wir nicht so leicht über menschliches Wesen oder eine Essenz reden. Das bedeutet, gibt es wirklich eine menschliche Natur in Konfuzius oder nicht? Und dann, meine Perspektive ist, dass es gibt keine menschliche Natur bei Konfuzius, es gibt eine Bewegung. Und diese Bewegung ist auch sehr wichtig, wenn man betrachtet die Beziehung mit Vater und Sohn und mit Bruder und so weiter. Und dann meine Frage ist, kommst du wirklich zurück zu Konfuzianismus oder zu Analektus von Konfuzius, oder ist das, wie der Konfuzianismus entwickelt hat? Weil ich denke, im Konfuzius gibt es keine Essenz, gibt es keine menschliche Natur. Das ist meine Interpretation. So wie in dem Taoismus. Das ist der ponto. Bom, a questão que eu coloquei para ele é se ele não foi muito duro com o confucionismo e muito benevolente com o taoísmo, porque eu particularmente não vejo, não é que não vejo, são duas perspectivas diferentes, mas tanto o confucionismo como o taoísmo voltam a um ponto fundamental da história da filosofia chinesa. Então, para os dois, a relação entre yin e yang, para os dois é importante. Para as duas correntes, o I Ching é um livro importante, é o livro das transformações, é o livro das mudanças. Portanto, quando a gente pensa a ideia de natureza humana, tanto no Confúcio quanto no taoísmo, nós temos que levar em conta que não é algo estático, que é algo que está em movimento. Portanto, nesse sentido, natureza humana não pode ser pensado tanto no confucionismo quanto no taoísmo na perspectiva nossa. Por quê? Porque aquilo que nós chamamos de essência é, em última instância, o movimento para os dois, né? Confúcio retorna ao I Ching permanentemente. O I Ching é um livro fundamental para o Confúcio, é um dos clássicos do confucionismo. Então, quando a gente lê o Confúcio a partir da perspectiva da dinâmica do I Ching, nós temos outro Confúcio muito diferente desse que se estruturou socialmente, desse que foi absorvido pelo Estado e tal e tudo mais, né? Então, eu só achei que ele retorna mais aos textos taoístas e retorna pouco aos textos confucianos e retorna mais ao desenvolvimento social do confucionismo. Essa é a pergunta.
I respond in English, right? Thank you for your question. Of course, this is not about Confucianism in total or Taoism in total. This is about the philosophy of the Zhuangzi, as the book title says. And what the Zhuangzi criticizes is not Confucianism in total, but let's say real existing Confucianism at the time. Just to give you a contemporary example, we might say that between communism and Catholicism, ultimately there is not such a big difference. They're all about the same ideals and so forth, right? So this is maybe 2,000 years from now, you can say, oh, come on, these fights between whatever, the communist revolutionaries and the Catholic conservatives, they were not really that big of a deal. Ultimately, they were fighting for the same ideals, right? If you only see it from the broader perspective. But that's not what the context in which the Zhuangzi was written and which, at least how we think it should be understood. It's a critique of real existing Confucianism at the time and of the real existing Confucian, let's say, semantics and the Confucian propaganda at the time, right? So, and in this sense, it is a subversion of the existing practice of Confucianism at the time. So, I mean, you can also say, well, what made a communist critique, or why do they critique the Catholic Church? They share the same ideals. Well, they're not concerned with that. They're concerned with the effects this doctrine had in the contemporary society and which it did effect on the concrete social and economic circumstances at the time. So, of course, from a wider philosophical perspective, we can say, yeah, these ideals all converge. But again, this is not what it's about. It's a critique of the application of a certain ideological system and its application in a concrete socio-economic practice 2,000 years ago in China.
Allow me to continue my question, which I have posed before. I'm a little astonished to hear that the word authenticity is used in a modern interpretation to Taoism, and that is not the word which is to be found in the text of Taoism. And two questions. What? A simple and naive question. If this word, authenticity, is used to understand better Lao Tzu, is it then still it must be possible to find some character or word or letter in the text itself. Otherwise, it could be understood as an interpretation from outside, from a modern idea. And the text should be interpreted on the ground of the text itself. Then that is my principle. And text itself must speak, must talk. And if some word is used into the interpretation of this word, that is possible, but still I would like to, you have talked much about this, but still the concentrating point of the interpretation with the word authenticity as the essence of the idea of Lao Tzu, then you should show some key sentences or key words. That's my question. And the second question, which is combined with my first, is the interpretation of the word authenticity. Is this influenced by Heidegger? If so, by Heidegger, for Heidegger there is the word Eigentlichkeit, authenticity, is always combined with Uneigentlichkeit. And Uneigentlichkeit and Eigentlichkeit, that is in the context of the in German to say Seinsfrage, the question of being. And if this question of being, is it also to be found in Lao Tzu?
Well, maybe there's a misunderstanding going on. My whole paper was about showing that authenticity is not a good concept to understand Taoism, but it is overwhelmingly applied in the contemporary Western literature, and this is just one example of many. And the whole point of the book was to show that this authenticity framework, which is taken from Heidegger and others, is not a good framework for interpreting Taoism. So you should ask your question to the people who defend this framework. I cannot answer your question because I'm not defending the framework.
Yeah. I have got a false impression, but as you have used always this term, in strategic viewpoint, then I have asked myself, what is the word?
Thank you, Georg. And this is actually very intriguing and a great project. So I know the authenticity, you criticize authenticity, which is true. You know, it's an illusion if we think about understand the Taoist text. However, that's the only way people can understand, I think. The only simplest way you can grasp, and it's beautiful. It's really cool. But then the question for you is, I think, well, how do we actually practice genuine pretending, right? Or there's no practitioner, but not a practice. You just have a critical mind, and that's it. And then you understand what it is, you just flow with it. And forget about authenticity, but what's the alternative? So if you can point out the alternative to practice Zhuangzi's version of individuality or freedom, that would be wonderful.
First of all, I very much disagree that authenticity is the only framework within which you can interpret the Taoist text. They have been interpreted very differently, also within China. Actually, I'm very happy to see that the Chinese translation of the book gets very positive responses from Chinese readers, because they by no means think that authenticity, you can check it on Douban, is the only available framework. I think that's absurd. I mean, even at the beginning of the 20th century, by people like authors like Lu Xun and others, they have very much already read Taoism, as we do in the book, as a socio-political critique. It's a socio-political critique. And it's not about any kind of, it's not supposed to give a guideline for yoga practices for 21st century Westerners. That wasn't the point of the Zhuangzi at the time. And I have no interest in pointing out to people like this what they can learn from Taoism. It's not my interest in transposing the text into this kind of context. I'm more interested in how contemporary Chinese readers read it as a potential avenue for a social critique of the pressures and the regimes they are suffering from. So that's number one. And then genuine pretending is not a norm. It's not a normative thing. We are all genuinely pretending. Everyone right now is genuinely pretending. And we all assume certain roles, and we, to a certain degree, identify with them. And the whole point is not to over-identify, to develop the capacity not to be over-identified with the contingent social roles consisting of our gender, of our social position, of our skin color, and so forth, that we have and that we cannot get rid of, but at the same time, not to over-identify with such positions. And this is not, again, some kind of yoga practice which brings us to another dimension of life, but it helps us to develop a socio-political critical attitude no matter in which society we are.
Hello. Just as a comment to what you have just said, if we could, and to finish this morning session, if we could just think about a kind of more elaborate and systematic technique of de-identification. So that, for example, when you speak about, in the end, that there is no rejection of the roles, we could think about, instead of a philosophy of A or B, to think about a philosophy of transition, where sincerity is a step towards authenticity, in the Western terminology. Ok, thank you very much. Ok, a gente vai parar aqui.